Life is a bundle of surprises. In just a few days, it could change dramatically in what feels like the blink of an eye. One moment, you're destitute in complete darkness for more than half of your life and escaping that stranglehold into the world above. The next, you're sinking back into its grips to save everyone you love by adorning the heavy crown of a broken people. Changelings, in this case. Yet despite the harrowing adventures you might have lived in that time, how was it that you were never as clammy, never as anxious, and never as nervous as the moment you walked into your first day of class? Was this some hidden, sinister effect of this school everyone talked about? Even just standing in front of the door and being left to wait with all the eerie, foreboding tension in the world to be introduced to a sizable class of miniature pony folk, there was little doubt that adults had a sadistic way of teaching lessons. Was it some elaborate prank, perhaps? Chris wondered this as she took her first steps into what would essentially become her new normal every day for the foreseeable future. As she got up to the elevated platform in front of the classroom, she had to part the overflowing bright green of her hair from her eyes to see the tall, commanding figure of the imposing Miss Cheerilee. She had been given extremely strict instructions to follow every beck and call of this pony mare before her. Or well, all that had been said was, make sure you listen to your teacher, okay? For Chris, however, this might as well have been meant as an imperative life or death order. As a creature with no social experience and not even being able to discern the gravity of importance in others' words, the poor little changeling was a bundle of nerves as she considered the possibility of every worst-case scenario. How does one do well in school? What if she could not make friends like she was told to? Would she be abandoned again if she failed in these tasks? Was she already abandoned without having known how? It took every ounce of willpower to hold her tears back as she remembered Twilight Sparkle walking away after having dropped her off at school. As a changeling, her very body struggled to stay intact in her original form as her skin looked like it was stuttering and shaking in waves. Much as she had grown emotionally, she still instinctively felt the need to change her form in her panic. But her promise of the purple alicorn was incredibly important to her, so she did not yield, even as she turned to face the rest of the faces of her new classmates at Miss Cheerilee's signal. Her deeply amber eyes immediately fell to the floor in order to distract her from the gazes. Oh boy, this is going to be quite a difficult promise to keep, she already thought. There was an immediate buzz of excitement, wonder, and even fear in the air as every single tiny pony exclaimed their surprise at the sight of her, whispering amongst themselves aggressively as Miss Cheerilee left them to talk for a bit. Twilight had discussed the situation with Cheerilee prior to this, and to what Chris could guess at from looking at her satisfied expression and the amusement in the flame of her soul, was that this was the exact reaction she had been gunning for. Shock therapy for a wounded reputation amongst racists. Alright, settle down, boys and girls. It's time to introduce our new friend here. Miss Cheerilee shushed the class with some rather soft words, as she hadn't had to shout or even finish the sentence before every pony became quiet in order to listen in with curiosity. As you can see with your own eyes, our friend is very special. Would you like to say a few words to introduce yourself? She said as she gestured over to Chris, who was now looking at her wide-eyed in horror. Her smile did not help the poor girl. Chris turned her head over to the class and pawed the ground gingerly, trying to muster her courage. As she opened her mouth, nothing came out. She felt frozen with terror as the seconds ticked by, hoping she'd be saved by the teacher. But in the silence, she could feel that Miss Cheerilee would not budge on this. How cruel. Name, Chris, I am... She managed to ink out after some many agonizing moments in total quiet. Race, changeling. Transfer. She squeaked out the last bit of her introduction in a high-pitched tone, as she had been spooked by the looks that the class gave her. Now within the mix of emotions in the air was confusion, as every pony couldn't tell if her speech pattern was a joke or a product of nervousness. Chris turned to look at the sound of hoofs clapping together as Miss Cheerilee applauded her with a bright smile, adding to the confusion for everyone involved. That was pretty wonderful, Chris, thank you, she said as she draped the foreleg over the anxious changeling. So there you have it, boys and girls. Our new transfer student is Chris, a changeling under the tutelage and care of Princess Twilight. I hope we can all get along with her. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions and concerns about her, so for today's lesson, we'll talk about the changeling race so we can learn more about our new friend. Miss Cheerilee brought a chair for Chris to sit in while still being in front of the class, much to her chagrin, as she began the special lessons in front of everyone. Any questions? Tons of hooves, wings, and horns shot up in that moment as the teacher began scanning the room to select one of her own choosing. Chris couldn't really see what was happening as she hid her face underneath her hair to look down at the ground in her shame. The first to answer was a haughty tone of a particularly pink and self-serving filly. "Aren't changelings dangerous? Why is Princess Twilight taking care of her?" It was never going to be easy. Even as Twilight had explained the concept of school to Chris, she knew it had been a bad idea from the start, as just her first real meeting with Twilight and her friends, who were more open and tolerating than most other ponies, had been catastrophic as she had seen the scars her race had created. She had been reminded of them just this morning, in fact, when she saw the faces and fires of onlookers as she walked down towards the school for the first time in public with Twilight. But to hear that question be asked directly right in front of her, well, it hurt. It really did. Especially now that she was out here like this trying to make a change, for her own sake, and especially for the sake of her kind. As much as she hated the idea to start with, Twilight had spoken too much sense to the point of being unable to deny it. If Chris was to rehabilitate her people into the life and freedom of the outside world, she would need to work on making a home for them. It was her duty as Changeling Princess to create the roads that led to peaceful cohabitation by making friends of the pony race. However, the first step towards this road began with proper communication, and talking straight was something she was still not capable of, especially after a lifetime living in isolation within total darkness. These were all the puzzle pieces Twilight thought to connect by making Chris go to school. It not only served to help her work on her speaking ability, but it would also allow her to make friends with ponies who could help increase the reputation and rapport of changelings as a whole. While she worked to sway public opinion in her capacity as newly crowned princess, Chris would make the beginning steps towards the freedom she sought for her kind. What the purple bookworm could not understand in the heat of that excitement, however, was that Chris was still very young and quite sensitive. She had a similar disposition and temperament to Fluttershy, and her serious personality and incredibly strong emotions made her prone to misunderstandings. The little changeling princess could also read every creature's true nature and meaning in their words by looking at the heart of their souls, a living flame in everyone. This was a unique ability only afforded to her, but it meant that as sensitive as she was, being able to understand the real thoughts in others only spelled disaster. As if to prove this point, as Miss Cheerilee had denied that changelings were dangerous, Chris could easily see how little that answer had done to dissuade anyone from that idea. The teacher had purposely chosen that particular pony as if knowing she would ask it too, in an act to emphasize it. But even Miss Cheerilee's flame wavered as she spoke, and Chris was saddened by knowing that she did not fully mean her own words from the bottom of her heart. Unbeknownst to Twilight, she had cast her into the fiercest battlegrounds of emotions known to pony kind, or really any sentient race for that matter. The dreaded school, where kids were relentless both on the inside and on the outside. To make matters worse, beyond her specialized and sensitive personality, as royalty to the changelings, of all things, a race who fed on emotions, her magic vessel and aptitude was enormous. Chris's magical powers had the capacity to rival even the extremities of Equestria, such as the elements of harmony, who had been powerless to stop Queen Chrysalis as she had fed on her negative feelings. This was undoubtedly a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. Still struggling to keep her form, Chris held back tears as she shouldered her new reality. After finally having been reunited with Twilight, it was obvious how much she meant to her, and how much she wanted to honor her expectations of her. The responsibility she carried had made her see the simple task of going to school and making friends that much more important and daunting. For everyone's sake, she thought in her head as Miss Cheerilee had moved on to teaching every pony in the class a mythicized version of how the changelings fell to ruin, and how it was their collective sacrifice that had imprisoned them underground when trying to fight off the powers that ruined their kingdom. It was very far from the truth, but Chris figured that this was part of Twilight's plan to ease pony society into accepting changelings gradually over time, as the current generation of Equestria only knew of their initial invasion of Canterlot during a royal wedding. Children were not as clueless as adults thought they were, as they had surely heard of the invasion and the details surrounding it. They knew of the Mad Queen Chrysalis and her bid to rule Equestria, It was why the question that was first asked had even surfaced to begin with. Thankfully, Chris's saving grace at this point in time was that they were none the wiser about her origins as princess and the direct predecessor to the queen. Even if told directly, they would have thought of it as a joke to consider that the scared little girl in front of them was anything more special than just another changeling. Even so, there were still a few bright minds among the ponies who could see the puzzle pieces themselves. Why her name resembled the queen so closely, why she was the only changeling they were seeing in Ponyville for the first time, and why it was that she was under the supervision of Princess Twilight. Sure, they didn't have any proof to back up their suspicions, but they understood something fishier was afoot with their appearance here and now. They were not at all scared of the prospect of finding out the truth, as their adventurous spirit made them that much more excited to uncover it. Who were these special little ponies who had come to this conclusion on barely the first day of Chris's arrival? Well, who knows? Chris didn't. She was counting down the seconds, trying to distract her mind until the end of school, as the conversation floated from topic to topic about changelings this, changelings that. Thankfully, Twilight had some sense and foresight, as she had waited to introduce Chris to school on one of its shorter days, as to not overwhelm her with her first experience. As the bell rang early, the princess herself was waiting outside to pick her up, and the little changeling just about bolted to the door in her absolute relief that she hadn't been abandoned, and happiness at the day being done. Twilight and Chris spent that afternoon furthering her vocal lessons at her home in the library. They practiced formulating complete sentences with little success. "Thank you very much," said the sleepy visage of the changeling princess as the sun was beginning to set. Twilight very gently used her wings to wipe away at the sleep forming on Chris's eyes as she smiled at her with all the warmth in the world. "That's a start, Chris. I'm proud of you," she said sincerely, "for more than just creating that sentence. Thank you for following along with my idea of going to school. It's never easy meeting new ponies, but I know you'll do just fine," she said as she brought her forehead to hers. It seemed as Twilight had not forgotten how to read the little changeling princess at all, as she could easily see the anxiety in her heart. Chris allowed herself to sink into Twilight's hug as she felt her warmth, yawning at the exhaustion from today's events. Before she had realized it, Chris had fallen asleep in that embrace. She awoke to the rocking of Twilight's back as they walked through the rocky, uneven lands of the ever-free forest towards a familiar cave, her two wings securing her in place. "You woke up just in time, Chris. We're already home," Twilight said as she noticed the shuffling from the confused changeling on her back. "Same time tomorrow, okay? I'll be right here." She got to her knees to allow her to disembark easily, her amber eyes groggily fluttering open and trying to make sense of her surroundings as she straightened herself up. She said enthusiastically. If nothing else, she was happy to hear that she would get to see Twilight again. That single promise alone made going to school worth it. They exchanged one last hug before Chris slinked back into the pitch-black darkness of the cave, and down the cold winding corridors of those ancient tunnels. As she walked, she could see more crystals having appeared since the last time she had faced the Queen in earnest to save her friends. Their emerald green glow was still faded and dim, but they grew stronger the more she traveled the length of those echoing halls. Finally, having reached the familiar room where her mother slept, Chris used her magic to illuminate the scones and emeralds with their own unique shade of golden warm light. To school, met lots ponies, saw Twilight, happy," Chris said with enthusiasm as she sat down beside the bed where the unconscious body of Queen Chrysalis lay. She continued to practice her vocal lessons as she spoke about her day to the Queen in as much detail as she could muster. Finally, as she walked away to move out of the room, Chris felt the Queen's body restlessly shift within her deep sleep, as if troubled by something. She walked over to her to place their foreheads together, much like she had done with Twilight. It was initially a spell the purple mare had taught her, but it had also become Chris's personal sign of affection. As her horn lit up with the power of her golden fate, her magic, it enveloped the two in a soothing warmth. Queen Chrysalis began to breathe easier as her night terrors had been blown away. Chris turned around one last time as she walked away to make sure that the Queen was feeling better, and in seeing that she was, she left to go handle the rest of her duties. There was still a lot she needed to do, as she needed to repeat that spell for every single one of the fallen changelings who had been consumed by the madness of the past. Had she really learned anything about the history of changelings if she was still living in those times? She wondered as the night grew older and her powers a little weaker with the exhaustion that came from overusing it. Finally done, she retired to her own chambers to give her own restless soul time to relax. Even if she had been a little disappointed in herself for having handled the day poorly, she had been beside herself with joy at being able to spend more time with Twilight. More than that, now it felt like she was making real progress towards helping her kind. It certainly beat being that lost little child that had wondered if darkness was the only thing she was ever going to get to know. She wasn't the same changeling that had thoughtlessly abandoned her duties and almost brought ruin to everyone in her weakness. She was no longer running away from her problems and from herself, as she took all of her feelings and emotions in stride. She had already promised herself many times before that she would do everything in her power to carry those responsibilities to the very end, wherever that road finished. She would brave school, find some friends, and possibly, maybe, hopefully, not burn out as a result. I mean, it was just grade school, right? Can't be too hard, she thought.